Hi, welcome to Pattern Cut with Clicked. My name is Lee and I'm the creator of Clicked Pattern Kits. I'm also teach fashion here in Sydney, and I just did shirt collars with my students this week. And when I give a class, I often like to share some good videos afterwards, whether it's sewing techniques or things get them inspired. So I had a bit of a look on YouTube for some shirt collar videos to share, and I was really surprised by what I found. I didn't go through every shirt collar video, but the top 6 or 7 all showed 2 pattern pieces when they showed how to make a shirt collar pattern. I've worked in the industry for over a decade for brands like Alexander McQueen and Jenny Packham. I also studied pattern cutting at St Martin's in London, so I can say with absolute certainty that shirt collars have 3 pattern pieces. So I kind of thought everyone knew this. So after I saw those YouTube videos, I didn't see all of them, so maybe it's on there somewhere, but top rated ones didn't seem to show it properly. So I went on a deep dive on the internet and see if I could find any websites or blog posts that are talking about it. And yeah, I couldn't find any pattern cutting resources that were showing how to do it properly, which surprised me. But I did find sewing blogs, and these sewing blogs had found a workaround because they know from teaching people online how to sew that 2-piece pattern cut for a shirt doesn't work. So their workaround was to get the second piece, the one that goes underneath this little inner collar here, and they would trim off about 1/8 of an inch, which is about 3 millimeters. And in the end, a seamstress or someone who's sewing shouldn't have to have a workaround. Your pattern should be correct. And if you're a home sewer and you've been using a 2-piece shirt collar and finding your collar isn't sitting correctly and looking good, this is probably why. And while I've labeled this video as a professional way to do it, yes, if you're a professional, you should be doing this because there's no way a seamstress in a factory is going to sit there trimming the edges off. The pattern will get sewn the way it is. But more so, if you're a home sewer making clothes for yourself, I know how long it takes to make a shirt. You've bought beautiful fabric, you're really excited about it, and yeah, you want to make sure you've done the best pattern you can. So it's not hard to do the 3-piece shirt collar, so let's get into it. I've broken this video down into 4 stages, and I've added timestamps in the description so you can skip sections you don't need. I'll start with a quick overview so you can understand the different components of the collar and how we create them. I'll then share the standard centre back, stand and collar measurements for different sized collars. I'll then show you how to draft the pattern and adjust it to match your design. And once you're happy with the shape, I'll show you how to finish the pattern and use it to create an inner collar. I'm going to show you the collar pattern I created for my oversized shirt block, which is available on my website, clickedpatternkits.com. So a shirt collar should have 3 pattern pieces: a collar stand, an outer collar, and an inner collar, and they're usually symmetrical. Let's look at the collar stand first. As you can see, the collar stand is a nice smooth curved shape. Let's have a look at the notches. So in the center at the bottom here, you have the center back notch. You then have a notch where the shoulder seam meets the collar stand, where the first placket line or where the placket starts on the front here, and a notch at the center front, and then the end of the collar stand is where the shirt ends. At the top, there is a notch where the collar finishes on the collar stand, and then there's a notch somewhere in the middle. Whenever you have 2 patterns joined together, you should always have a notch somewhere along the seam so you can place them correctly. And then there's another notch at the top of the center back here. All these notches and the shape in general, because the piece is symmetrical, are repeated on the other side. The last thing to talk about is the button and buttonhole placement. If your shirt is right over left, the buttonhole will be on the right hand side and the button will be on the left, and vice versa if you want the other way around. And just so you know, women's clothing is traditionally right over left and men's is left over right, but you do whatever you want. The button is always on the center front, near the center of the collar stand pattern, while the buttonhole starts about 2 millimeters or 3 millimeters closer to the edge. So the button sits like this over the buttonhole. Why isn't it in the center? Because when we move in the shirt and pull it, the button will actually move to that point. That's kind of where it naturally sits when we wear it. It will move to the end of the buttonhole. That's how we create the pattern, if that makes sense. Now onto the outer collar. So the shorter, longer edge is sewn to the top of the collar stand, so it has the same notches. It has a center back notch, the same joining notch, and the outer collar finishes here. So you can see everything matches. Then on the outer edge of the outer collar, there is a center back notch, and then there's another joining seam notch, which will match to the inner collar pattern. The inner collar has the same notches and general shape as the outer collar, but it's about 4 millimeters smaller along the collar edge. This makes the edge seam roll under, so it isn't visible, giving you a cleaner finish and a better looking collar. Now let's talk about collar measurements. These are the standard center back measurements I refer to when I create collars. And I say refer because I want you to think of these as a guide. As you can see, I have 3 different sizes. At the top, I have the measurements I would use for a more fitted tailored shirt. Below that are the measurements I would use for an oversized shirt. And at the bottom is a very oversized shirt, so if you want to really accentuate the collar details. The standard collar measurements ensure that the collar sits nicely, and most importantly, the collar covers the back of the stand. And we are ready to start drafting. So the collar is attached to the neckline, so the first thing we need to do is measure the neckline, so we make sure the collar fits it. So I need to measure from the center back to the shoulder seam. And it's 8.2 centimeters. I'll then measure from the shoulder seam to the first placket line. This is the point where my placket starts. And it's 12.2 centimeters. I'll then measure from the first placket line to the center front. And remember, the center front is actually really important because that's where we're going to position our button and buttonhole. And that measurement is 1.2 centimeters. And I'll then measure from the center front to the edge of the placket. This is where my collar stand is going to end. And it's also 1.2. These 2 measurements here should be about the same because the center front should be in the middle of your placket. And I'm using my oversized shirt block for this demonstration, which has a standard sort of self-face placket. And as you can see, when I fold it here, this is the edge of my placket. Now that I have the neck measurements, I can start drawing my collar stand. So I'll grab a piece of paper and draw a horizontal line along the bottom. It doesn't need to be a specific length, just long enough that you can fit the neck measurements on there. So my neck measurements are about 22.8 centimeters, but it doesn't need to be exact, just a long enough horizontal line. Then towards the left-hand side, I'll draw a short vertical line. This is where the collar stand center back will be. I'm going to use my oversized measurements for this demonstration, so the collar stand will be 3.5 centimeters at the center back. So I'll measure up 3.5 centimeters along the vertical line. Then I'll get my center back to shoulder seam measurement, which is 8.2 centimeters, and I'll measure that distance from the center back vertical line along the horizontal line and draw a notch. This will be my shoulder notch. This section of the collar stand between the center back and the shoulder doesn't curve much, so it's pretty much a rectangle. So I'll mark 3.5 centimeters up from the shoulder notch and connect the 2 points. Now I'll draw the curved front of the stand. To create the curve, I'll use my total neck measurement and measure this distance from the center back along the horizontal line. I'll then draw a vertical line 1.5 centimeters up. I'll now connect the shoulder notch to the top of this line. I've used 1.5 centimeters because I like the way it sits around the neck. If you increase this amount to say 1.9 centimeters, the stand will be more curved and sit further from the neck. If you use a smaller measurement, the stand will sit closer to the neck. So I'll grab my French curve and draw a nice smooth line from the perpendicular line at the front to the shoulder notch. This will be the base of my stand. Make sure the curve is evenly spread across the area and that the line straightens out near the front. Once I'm happy with the line, I'll mark my neck measurements on it. So my shoulder to first placket line measurement is 12.8 centimeters. So I'll measure that distance along the line from the shoulder point and mark it. I'll then get my first placket to center front measurement and measure and mark that distance on the line too. I'll then grab my ruler and draw 2 short perpendicular lines to create my notches at these points. And before I forget, I'll label my center front and center back. And the final measurement is the center front to placket edge. I want this section to be a bit straighter, so I'll just redraw the base here so it's straight and mark the end point here. Great, so the base of the stand is done and I've got all my notches, so now I need to finish the top of the stand. To do this, I'll put my ruler on the center front mark and measure up perpendicularly by 3 centimeters and just put a little mark. Why 3 centimeters? We want the front of the collar to be a bit lower than the back, so it sits nicely around the neck. I'll then use my French curve to connect this point with the back of the stand. Then I need to draw the sort of curved shape of the front here. So I'll grab my French curve and I want it to be sort of a bit perpendicular at the base. And ooh, that didn't really work at all. To be honest, I don't use the French curve that much because I've done this so many times and I know how it should look. So I'm just going to go freehand here and draw a curve. So I'm just going to get a nice curve shape coming out, nice round at the top and a straight sort of perpendicular 90-degree angle at the bottom. I'll then draw the joining seam notch along the top here. And I'll also mark where the collar will end. So it's important there's a gap. The collar should start a little bit back from the center front. So if you were to draw an imaginary line up from the center front perpendicularly, finish the collar about 1 centimeter inwards. I don't have an exact measurement for this, but the important thing is you want a bit of a gap between the center front and the start of the collar. Great. So the collar stand outline is done, so we can move on to the collar. To create the collar, I'll get a new piece of paper and draw a vertical line about 8 centimeters long. This will be my collar center back. Then I'll grab my cutting mat, lay the paper on top, and then pin the collar stand on top of it. Make sure the center back of the collar stand is on top of the center back of the collar. Then pin it in place and trace around the edges of the collar stand with the tracing wheel. And remember to copy the notches too. Now, I'll grab a pencil and draw over the top of the collar stand. I only need to draw between the center back and the collar end notch. This will be the inner seam of my collar. Now I'll draw the outer edge. I'm using the oversized measurements, so my collar center back will be 5 centimeters long. So I'll just draw a vertical line out from the top of the stand at the center back. The curved tip of the collar usually starts curving after the shoulder, so I'll measure perpendicularly out from the joining seam notch, which is near the shoulder notch, and make a mark 5 centimeters out. I'll then draw a straight line between these two 5 centimeter measurements. To draw the collar point, I'll put my ruler on the collar end notch and rotate it till it's about 7 millimeters away from the center front notch. I'll then draw an 8 centimeter long line. Now I'll grab my French curve and connect the front point with the back. Now I'm going to draw 3 slash lines evenly spaced along the collar and cut along them, finishing just before the top. And I'll just cut from this side too so I can rotate them, and don't do that. I'm just sticking a small piece of paper under each section and then spreading it about 5 millimeters, and I'll stick it in place. And I'll do this for all 3 slash lines. Once I'm done spreading, you'll see the lines are all jagged now, so I'll just redraw over the lines so they're nice and smooth. Great. Okay, so we've got the outline shape of our stand and collar, and if you're following along with this demo, I want you to stop and put the pattern on the mannequin. When I'm teaching pattern cutting, I give students the measurements to get them started, but tell them this is just sort of a general base to get them going. Each design is unique, and if you're new to pattern cutting, or even if you're experienced, often staring at a bunch of lines on a page doesn't really give you the answers you need. It can be quite abstract, so the best thing to do is make a start, use these basic measurements, and then put it on the mannequin. And when you put on the mannequin, the fall of the collar at the back should be pretty good. What I want you to focus on is the front here. Classic style, or should the tips be more spread? How pointy do you want the points to be? My measurements will give you a good base for a classic shirt collar, but make it your own. Every design is unique. And when I tell my students to test the pattern on the mannequin, if I feel a bit of resistance, like they don't want to twirl it in calico, they kind of just want to move on with things, I tell them to do this. So grab your pattern outlines and add a seam allowance just along the seam that connects the collar stand to the collar. So that's the inner collar seam on the collar. Just draw a 1 centimeter seam allowance along there, and then get the collar stand and draw a 1 centimeter seam allowance between the center back and the end of collar notch at the top of the stand. Then cut out your pattern pieces and pin them together along the seam. Then just put it on the mannequin. So it doesn't sit as nicely as calico, but it's a really quick method and it's actually pretty accurate. So the collar of the back here is looking pretty good. It's just the front here I want you to focus on, because the front is based on your design. So if you want the point to be close to the front button placket, just stick some paper on and redraw the point. If you want it to be more pointy, come down further. If you want to bring it further across, just fold the paper or redraw the seam. It's a very efficient way of testing your pattern. When you're happy with the shape, take it off the mannequin and trace the pieces to create your final pattern. Start by getting a piece of paper big enough for both pattern pieces and draw a vertical line down the center. This will be the center back. Place both pieces on the line, pin them to the paper, and trace around the edges with a pencil. You'll need to use a tracing wheel to trace along the seams that have seam allowances added to them. Then, unpin the patterns and draw over the trace lines and notches with a pencil. So we've only got one half of the collar stand and collar here. So fold your paper along the center back line and then trace over the lines and notches again to the other side. Perfect! Now you have both sides of the pattern. When you unfold it, make sure that the lines are perpendicular to the center back. I often see students create a little bump here, especially when they're cutting out the patterns. It's really important this is a really straight section and it's at 90 degrees to the center back. And when you're happy with your lines, you can add your 1 centimeter seam allowances. Oh, and don't forget to add the notches to the seam allowance too. Now I'll add the grain lines. So just draw a horizontal line across the collar stand and put 2 arrows on it going in the same direction. And while I remember, I'll write to the center front on both sides. I'll then label the pattern piece. I'll call it collar stand and write cutting instructions, cut 1 pair self plus fuse. The collar stand is always fused. Now I'll do the same for the outer collar. So just draw a horizontal line across the pattern piece and put 2 arrows going in the same direction. And I'll call the pattern outer collar and write cutting instructions, cut 1 self. So it's not a pair because we're going to do an outer collar and an inner collar. And I don't usually fuse the outer collar piece. If you want to make a really stiff looking collar or sort of more corporate work collar, then yes, you can fuse this piece, but I usually fuse the inner collar and leave the outer collar unfused. Great, so I've cut out my pattern pieces and I've got one more thing to do on the collar stand. I've got to add my button and buttonholes. So the button is always on the center front in the center of the collar stand. So I'll just mark the center of the button and then draw a cross over it and draw a dashed line around the cross. Then I'll mark the buttonhole. The buttonhole is just a horizontal line with 2 short perpendicular lines at each end, and it's about 3 millimeters longer than the button diameter. So my button for this shirt was 1.2 centimeters, so I drew a 1.5 centimeter line. And one final thing on the outer collar. I just need to add a notch along the outer edge. This is just a joining seam notch, which I'll put on the inner collar as well. Okay, we're almost there. We just need to make the inner collar. The inner collar is pretty much the same shape as the outer collar, so we'll trace the outer collar and use it as a base to create the inner collar. Now I'll remove the outer collar pattern. The shorter longer edge, which is where the inner and outer collar are sewn to the collar stand, is the same on the outer and inner collar, so I'll just draw over my traced lines and notches. However, the outer edge of the inner collar is slightly smaller than the outer collar, so I'll just measure in about 4 millimeters here and connect it to the inner seam. Then rather than drawing over the trace seam along the edge here, I'll put my ruler on it and draw a line 4 millimeters in all the way across. And I'll do the same steps on the other side. and add a 1 cm seam allowance along all the edges. And we're almost finished. I just got to add the grain line on the pattern piece. So I'll draw a horizontal line with 2 arrows going the same direction. And then I'll label the pattern piece inner collar with cutting instructions, cut oneself plus fuse. And your shirt collar pattern is done. This is the simplest way I've found to create a great fitting shirt collar. But as I said, use these measurements as a guide to draw your outline, then get it on the mannequin or yourself and turn into your own pattern. And if you are interested in learning more about shirt pattern cutting, I've just written a 140-page guide on it. This guide is part of my do-it-yourself pattern cutting kits, which are made for fashion designers and people who have just started to learn pattern cutting. The kit has a block, which looks like this, the oversized shirt kit. There are different styles, so this is the oversized shirt kit. So the block looks like this. When you file it up, it's already got some design features on it, so it makes it easy to create your pattern. I know how confusing it can be to do things like cuffs and even collars and plackets. It can be a bit overwhelming when you're starting out, so my blocks include design features, and then this guide shows you how to change the block into sort of any design based on oversized shirts. So I have sort of 6 different front button plackets, maybe 6 or 7 collar types, how to do different pockets, how to change the yoke, how to add style lines, how to change the sleeve, whether you want to change the shape of the cuff or completely remove it. So it's quite exhaustive. The guide, I've tried to include everything, but it's designed for beginners, so it's a great place to start if you're new to pattern cutting and trying to get your head around everything. And if you want more pattern cutting help, I'll be doing more videos soon, so subscribe to my YouTube channel to stay in touch.